Where do movies come from in the 1980s after all, you may ask? Well, as we've said, they come from studio distributors who produce films in partnerships. They also come from independent producers who independently distribute their films themselves. And to a greater extent than in previous decades, they come from those studios who pick up independently produced films. So the difference between our first and our third here is they are not working in conjunction with these outside producers. The producers are making the films however they want them, and then the studios pick them up, get the rights to license those films and distribute them. So, when this happens, it's called a negative pickup. The reason it's called a negative pickup, it's not any kind of negative reflection on the film, it's because it's referring to the cost of the negative, all the money that goes into making the negative of a movie. In other words, before you spend any money promoting the film or duplicating the prints, that is your negative cost. It's that essentially that first copy cost that we talk about in the media industries. So a negative pickup means that you're buying the rights to distribute a film and you're going to have to promote it, but the negative cost is how much it is for that independent producer to just get the thing made in the first place. Now, one of the things, though, is that movies get really expensive in the 1980s, much more expensive than they were before. One is inflation at the end of the 1970s and into the 80s affects a lot of the process, but so does what movies are like and the way that they get made, particularly a shift to incorporating more special effects that follows the success of Jaws and Star Wars, so that more movies want to have special effects, as well as a reliance on stars who are now demanding more and more money to show up and be in particular movies. In this system, agents become much more powerful in their representing stars and star directors and star writers too. They become really the powerful creative agents in Hollywood because they're helping put together these packages of talent and they're presenting them to these studio distributors and independent producers in order to get movies made. So there's costs that have to do with inflation just going on throughout the economy, the general conditions, but then there's also specific to the content, what the movies are like, incorporating more and more special effects, as well as actors getting more money. Now you might ask, how could it be that a movie that costs, say, tens of millions of dollars in the 1980s could be a safer bet than a movie that costs just less than $10 million? The answer is the idea that you've got to spend money to make the kind of movie that is going to be more of a surefire hit. That is, the money that goes into special effects or goes into hiring a star is thought to translate more directly into success, although it doesn't always. If you don't have those elements, you have a lot less likelihood of having a successful film. Therefore, it's not best just to go cheap, it's best to go expensive. So, this blockbuster mentality or megapick mentality is that stars and special effects, they're expensive, but they come with returns and they can also guarantee success for a long term, both in the mainstream American audience, which has lots of different tastes and diversity, as well as in other secondary markets and overseas, which is more and more important in the 1980s as the overseas distributions of film. So making that big box office also is a predictor of how successful a film will be in those secondary or ancillary markets like home video, because it both serves to raise awareness of a movie so people know about it because of the big box office. It generates demand that might not otherwise be there, both in terms of the audience as well as the people that are going to be in the companies that are going to be buying those rights to have the film in these other markets. In terms of how movies are marketing in the 80s, there is a real maturation, a more well-developed sense to how to go about cross-promoting your theatrical releases as well as your ancillary products like soundtrack albums, how to incorporate those into your promotions in various different ways, and the licensing of merchandise and product placement. By that, I'm referring to, not necessarily like a soundtrack, but say, for example, licensing Batman to a cereal. Having merchandise like toys, but then also just thinking about this as being a logo and a brand that essentially can be made in conjunction with or sold in conjunction with the various other items. So the way that Hollywood works in the 80s again is that it's talent agencies that are actually taking packages to studios increasingly, and when they do that, they can help the studios justify going ahead and giving the green light to making a movie. Market research is increasingly important and done throughout the process, from testing out concepts to testing scripts and even edits of film. But still, it remains a creative process where you're having to make decisions based on what you're going to follow and not follow. Now, the growth of all those markets in theater and cable TV, as well as videotape, does result arguably in a real diversity in types of content. Now, what that diversity is might not be what you have in mind, but there is a lot of different stuff that gets made out there. You have these independent studios who rise in order to compete with majors. And in fact, some of the more famous stars in action-oriented movies of the 1980s, like those starring Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, are in fact produced by these independent studios rather than the big major studios. People like Canon, Vestron, Carolco, these are studios that actually, while they'll mix, most of them, the kind of action or special effects oriented movies that maybe don't have a giant budget with artier fare, so that they're again providing a variety of different kinds of content that can be sold in various different markets. So, what is an independent after all? This is a question that's not always easy to answer. It might truly be a separate entity completely outside of any of the established studios. For example, Carolco was one of those kinds of independent studios. It also might be actually part of the studio, but operating in its own relative autonomy, making decisions about what it's going to produce and how it's going to promote separately from the main studio structure that's making those big mainstream blockbuster type movies. These are the studio classic type divisions, like Sony Classics is an example of that. Or they might be a production company that is attached to one of the major studios, doesn't follow studio guidelines or follow studio demands for what they're going to do, but works and offers up to that major studio what they've made first to see if they are going to want to distribute that film. And they receive some financing from them, but not the majority or very little when it comes to actually making the movies themselves. So an independent produces independently, but that is kind of the end. When it comes to distribution, you're almost always going to have from the movie studios. And what you do is you go around and you sell those distribution rights in order to get the financing to make your film. So the movie Hollywood Shuffle is an example of an independent film produced independently and picked up and distributed by a major studio distributor. It was supposedly made for less than $100,000, which is pretty incredible. Directed by and starring Robert Townsend, written by Townsend and Keenen Ivory Wayans. Townsend successful as a writer as well. Townsend and Ivory Wayans worked with Eddie Murphy, directing and writing his stand-up comedy films. This movie is a satire of Hollywood in the 1980s. It's a different look at what the movie industry was like in the 80s, and it satirizes the stereotypes of what black actors were expected to do and be like in Hollywood film, as well as Hollywood more generally. One of the things I think is interesting about this film as you see it is that its format is quite similar to a sketch comedy show like Saturday Night Live. And in fact, Keenen Ivory Wayans, after this film, would go on and start, in a couple of years anyway, the very successful Fox sketch comedy show In Living Color. So I hope you'll enjoy Hollywood Shuffle. It is a great example of both an independent film from the 1980s and a movie that is a satire of Hollywood.